We live in a time where masculinity is shamed and men don't know what it means to be a man. As a pastor and counselor, I've spent the better part of my life equipping and training others. My goal with this show is to translate my hard-earned experience into tools and tactics to help you become stronger as a man. This is the BraveCo podcast. I'm your host, Jason Vallotton. Hey BraveCo man, this week's episode is a teaching that I did for BSSM Online. I hope you guys really enjoy it.
Guys, I'm super excited. We have one of my favorite speakers. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, I took one of Jason's classes and got to watch him bring people up on stage and walk people through their own emotional health journey. And I learned so much from this man. He carries a ton of wisdom. But my favorite thing about Jason Vallotton is he's actually one of the most down-to-earth, legitimate humans there is. He is behind the scenes kind of running everything around here. And I could probably talk for like half an hour about all the roles he does at Bethel. But I'll just give you a couple of the kind of top ones. He is the Bethel men's pastor. He founded BraveCo, which is an incredible ministry for men. And he also oversees our transformation center. So I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of some of those services that are available through the transformation center, but he oversees that whole thing. And then he's an author, he's a dad, he's a husband, he's all the things. And just, I think you're going to receive so much today. He carries a ton of authority in emotional health and he carries wisdom. So I want you to just be ready to receive from the wisdom on his life and let your hearts be wide open to receive. I think many of you on this call, it's going to begin a process for you and accelerate a process into wholeness and complete healing. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the man, Jason Vallotton. Thanks for being here.
Right out of the gate, you guys will have to forgive me because I've had a cold and my voice is not as strong as it normally is. So it sounds like I'm going through my second puberty, which is fine. You know, I can embrace that. But that's just where I'm at today. Listen, I am really excited, honestly, to be on here today. I feel a lot of excitement in my heart. I do feel some sadness though. I only see two men on the call, and so to those Henry and Tim. I'm really counting on you guys to pull some weight today. Know what I mean? So, where are all the men? That's the question the women are asking today, right? Where are all the men? Where are the strong men? And we've got two. We've got Henry and we've got Tim. And so there's another man on here that I don't see. But anyways, my hope today is that I would unpack for you maybe a concept that you haven't thought about a lot. And you know, they ask you to do come on and talk about emotional health, and it's like uh, you know, it's a needle in a haystack, and there's for an hour. But this is just one of the aspects to me that I feel like I'm most interested in right now. So we're going to talk about what I want to talk about today and go down that road. And so hopefully you all are good with that. And I hope that you haven't heard me talk about this before, but if you have, I've heard me talk about it so many times and I'm still interested in it. So here we go. I want to talk about connection, but it's really important that when we start talking about connection, we talk about addiction, because you can't talk about connection without talking about addiction. They're one and the same coin. It's one side of connection. If it was a dollar, one side would be connection, the other side would be addiction. And you're going to find that out here in a minute. In the 1960s, actually in the 1950s, there was some experiments done to try to figure out how how addictive are drugs. And so a scientist took a bunch of rats, and one at a time he put them in a cage, and he put two different water bottles. Some of you may have heard this study before, but he put a water bottle that was just clean water, and then the other bottle that was laced with drugs. And 100% of the time with that study, the rats overdosed and died. 100% of the time. So again, he would take a rat, put it in a cage, isolated with a water bottle, with two water bottles, one fresh water, one drug laced water. 100% of the time, the rats die. So they come to this conclusion, right? What's the conclusion? The conclusion is that drugs have these hooks in them, right? Like Velcro or like a fish hook, that once you start indulging, that you can't stop. You're hooked. And that's where we get the term, hooked from. And but then a guy came along in the 1960s and 70s. And he started to look at that study, and he said, "Man, I wonder if that's really complete." And so what he did is he created this rat park, and you guys can look it up. It's called the Rat Park Experiment. But he took these rats and he created this park. He put loads of games in there and toys in there. They could run on the ball, or sorry, they could run on the wheel. They could play with the ball. But he also put lots of other rats in there. And then he put two water bottles. He put one fresh water, and he put one laced with drugs in there. What's really interesting is every once in a while, a rat would go and taste the drug laced water and use it recreationally once in a while. But none of the rats, zero of the rats ever overdosed and died. None of them. Zero. It's really interesting. See, he came to this conclusion that addiction has more to do with the cage that you're in than the drug that you're taking. See, we used to think that addiction had to do with the drug that you were taking. But addiction has more to do with the cage that you're in than the drug that you're taking. See, addiction starts in our life when you can no longer bear being present in your life. Addiction starts in your life when you can no longer bear being present. Well, let's dive into that. Because most of us can't even remember when we no longer wanted to be present in our life. Because that was before you were even conscious that you were alive. You understand that when you're born, you're not necessarily conscious that you're alive, that you're living, that you're born. It wasn't until probably 9 or 10 years old that I actually realized, like, wow, I'm a living, breathing being. I could, steal my parents' car. I could die. I can make a whole bunch of decisions. Up until that point, I wasn't super aware that I was even living. I was just existing. And maybe you remember the day that you started to feel like, wow, I'm alive. Like I'm alive. I'm a living creature. I can make all these decisions. And okay, well, before you got to that point, by the time you reached that point, you had already been wired and programmed in this world to know how valuable you are or invaluable, how worthy of love or connection or unworthy of love and connection, whether or not you're safe in this world, whether or not you needed to protect yourself. That was already all done for you. What people thought about you. See, we don't typically think about this, but your first inheritance was supposed to be an incredible inheritance of unconditional love and acceptance. You were supposed to be wired and programmed by your parents and then by your community. You weren't supposed to program and wire yourself. In fact, you didn't wire yourself. The way that you think, the way you see yourself, the way you see the world, the way you see God, the way you see other people right now, how safe you feel in this world, you didn't create that. That was created for you. Well, your appetite too, largely, was created for you. Kind of food you crave. Well, what were you introduced to? What were you exposed to? But we don't think about that a lot. We just think, man, something's wrong with me. Man, I hate how I feel. I don't know. Why am I suffering so bad? Why do I make such poor decisions? Why did I make such poor decisions growing up? Well, it's because of the way that you were wired. Why do I struggle with overeating? Or why do I struggle with self-harm? Or pornography or alcohol. There's lots of different ways that we become addicted, and lots of things we become addicted to. Social media. Why is it so hard for me? Well, see, well, when you grow up in a home with strong bonds and healthy attachment, what you learn is you learn how to regulate your nervous system, because a young child doesn't actually have the ability to regulate their nervous system. You guys understand that, right? A young baby, and a lot of you are moms, and probably the men in here have probably been dads too. You understand that a child doesn't have the ability to actually regulate their emotions. So, I've got 5 kids. My last son, who was born, is a year and a half old right now. He's 19 months old. His name's Liam, cutest little guy. When he was born, doesn't know how to calm himself down. So when he starts crying and he gets really worked up, right? What actually happens inside of us parents is we have chemicals are released when our babies cry, and it drives us to, there's a deep desire to come and to calm, right? To pull our kids close. And as we pick them up, right, we begin to rock them. And that motion, even that motion begins to stimulate their nervous system. Begin It's a continual motion, right? We know that motion, mom. Some of you are rocking right now, just thinking about it. You're sitting there as I'm talking about how to calm your kids, you're rocking. Well, what's that do? It activates their nervous system. Sometimes we bundle them up when we put their hands in front of their chest, right? And again, what's that doing? Well, it's what we do when we get nervous. If you walk into a counseling appointment and you're nervous, ladies, you're doing this. You don't realize you're doing that, but you are doing that. What's it doing? It's activating your nervous system. It's helping you calm down. Well, we do that for our kids, and we're helping them. We're teaching them that they're safe and they're loved and they're cared for. And then what are we creating? All these moments of conflict actually become these bonding points, right? Like my little child is learning that they're safe and that they can trust me and that I love them unconditionally, right? They're pooping their pants, they're making mistakes, they're spilling water over, they're spilling their meal, they're getting their meal all over them. And we're coming in to love them, to teach them to what? Co-regulate. They're learning how to co-regulate. Everybody say co-regulate. Even if you're really cool and maybe you know more of this content than I do. Co-regulation was one of our gifts that we give to our family, to our kids, and they learn attunement. They learn attunement through co-regulation. And what happens is, well, when you have when you have when you're able to co-regulate and you have healthy attunement and healthy attachment, but you don't really have a need for drugs and alcohol and pornography and overeating, and right, you don't really have a need for it. But imagine that you grow up in a home with unhealthy attachment, where there is no attunement, no healthy attunement, where there is no co-regulation, where you're left on your own to figure out how to regulate your emotions. And what I want you to remember again is all this is happening before you're aware of it. See, in a home where if how your parents, how they regulate their emotions, that is most often how you are going to regulate your emotions. So if you grow up in a home where mom felt chaotic, listen, the fruit of your mom feeling chaotic isn't that you're going to feel peaceful. The fruit of your mom feeling chaotic is that you feel chaotic because it's chaos. And I'm attuning and attaching to her. The the fruit of your dad feeling checked out, well, checked out has a vibe to it. It's scary. It's fearful. It could feel like abandonment. Well, what happens is, oh, I check out from myself too, right? I want to check out from the environment, and that's pain. And what do we do with pain, guys? We know what we do with pain. We medicate it. How many of you just want to sit in pain all day? I don't want to sit in pain all day. So unconsciously or subconsciously, we begin these cycles in our life of feeling overwhelmed or feeling uh, afraid or feeling disconnected and lonely and isolated. Well, we don't want to feel those things. And so we find ways to disconnect or medicate. That becomes, again, I'm going back to food, back to unhealthy relationships. I'm back to the pornography, we're back to, masturbation, all kinds of things. See, you can do all the things that you want to in emotional health, but if you don't actually understand the foundation of it all, the very foundation of it all, then you just spend so much time trying to figure out good principles, but you don't ever stop and think about, well, how the heck were you wired? How are you wired? You can't pray yourself into better wiring. I mean, God could come in and do a miracle, but you can't praise and worship yourself into better wiring, especially if you don't know that it was what happened. We glaze over that, right? We blow past that. We don't ever stop and look at our origin. What was your origin? What was your place of birth? What happened in your home? What were the emotions that were allowed in your home? If you grew up in a strong Christian home, you're probably allowed joy. Definitely not allowed anger. Sadness was probably not allowed either. If you were a man, probably weren't really allowed to cry. You needed to suck it up, right? You're going to be the man of the home when your dad left. A lot of responsibility. If you're the firstborn, right? Tons of responsibility, over responsibility. You're responsible for your siblings behaving and cleaning up messes. And there's a balance to it. I'm not saying all of it's bad, but we get taught all these things that make us perform, but mostly just make us anxious and fearful and disconnected. And what we don't understand is, man, before you were ever even addicted to whatever you think you're addicted to today, which could, again, all the things that we are addicted today, the addiction started long before you were ever even aware. Before you were ever even aware, you just traded one addiction for another. I was young. I At around 10 years old, I found masturbation, and masturbation became my drug of choice to bring peace and comfort and security. I was so addicted to masturbation. I mean, sometimes it would be 15 or 18 times a day. I didn't know why. I had no idea why. People go like, "Oh my God, you're trying to do the math on it." Don't try to do the math. It was a lot. That's how dysregulated I was. And I grew up in a home where I would say, man, I grew up in a good home. But I also grew up in an era, in a time when my parents were learning, how to cast out demons and do all the crazy stuff of early churches. And so we had people living in our home that were Satanists. And we had, youth kids that were manifesting demons, and those kids were literally chasing us upstairs and, you know, clawing and growling at my mom and screaming at my dad. And my parents didn't know, for them, it was fun. For them, it was exciting. We're doing what Jesus did. For me, it was a world that I had no idea how to explain. It felt very scary. I mean, for you today, if someone was screaming and growling, and even if it was a younger child, like, it was very unnerving, felt very unsafe. Our home, in that respect, my world felt very unsafe. So I spent a lot of my time crawling into my parents' room at night, laying on the floor, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, because I was just so scared. But I didn't know what anxiety was. So I was unable to actually share that I'm struggling with anxiety. I didn't know that I was struggling with anxiety. We just thought it was a spiritual battle, right? We thought that the battle that I was facing was spiritual. Well, it was partially spiritual, but it didn't necessarily start out as spiritual. It then became trauma, right? I've trauma stored up. And that's where, a lot of you struggle with ADHD and ADD or OCD. Well, where does that stuff come from? And it comes from unhealthy attachment. It comes from not knowing how to regulate your nervous system. That is your answer to a very dysregulated environment. on top of poor food, but we won't go there because I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not actually even a psychologist. I'm just a guy from Weaverville. So we end up in these addictions, and these addictive cycles and addictive personalities, and because we're trying to find a way to cope with life. We're trying to figure out a way to deal with um, the world that we feel so powerless in. So, and on top of that, if you don't feel special or important, I mean, women, if you don't feel pursued and cared for and nurtured and loved by your father, well, you're going to find that, right? You need somebody to affirm you. And so what do? I mean, you use you use your body or you use your emotions to try to get somebody to affirm you, to try to get them to say, wow, you're beautiful. Or you try success, right? Achievements. I work really hard to gain all these achievements, these accolades, so that someone will see me as valuable. And men, you do the same thing, right? Like success. How do I get success? How do I get power? That's what we're really looking for, men, because we have this question, do I have what it takes? That's going inside of us. And of course, women are asking the question, am I worthy to be pursued? But that question, do I have what it takes, drives us into greater and greater performance or greater and greater passivity because I don't actually believe that I have what it takes. So I don't even want to try. I just, I want to avoid the challenges and I want to avoid the pain of failure. And so again, I'm just trying to show us how we got to where we're at. I'm not assuming that everyone's in the same spot. I'm not assuming that everyone grew up in a home where you weren't, connected. I'm simply saying this is the foundation for emotional health. This is it right here. Is you didn't create it. You didn't get to choose what family you were born in. You didn't get to choose whether or not you were nurtured and adored and loved. You didn't get to choose that. So for most of us, it's not our fault. Before you go, whoa, he's making everybody a victim. It's not your fault. It is your responsibility. It is your responsibility now. It's your responsibility. So, your coping mechanism, you probably didn't create it, but it is your responsibility. And the big temptation for us people now, right now, the real big temptation for us is just to accept ourselves the way that we are. That's the big temptation, right? And I'm going to hurt some people's feelings here. I'm not trying to. And I'm not trying to confuse everybody either. I'm just trying to expose some things. The big temptation is just to love yourself the way that you are and to feel good about that. But it's very hard. It's very hard to break your own promises, to violate your conscience, and to feel good about yourself. It's very hard. It's very hard to overeat day in and day out and to feel proud of yourself. It's very hard. We weren't designed to do that. It's very hard to look at pornography and to do that. I'm not saying shame on you. I'm saying, well, this is why we don't have good, healthy relationships because we want people to love us in a way that we aren't loving ourselves. See, when I'm overeating constantly, when I'm damaging my body, when I'm looking at pornography, when I'm abusing substances, when I come home and I'm checking out from my family and checking out from my wife, I don't feel good about myself. I have to lie to myself and tell myself that I feel good about myself. I have to just pretend like I'm accepting myself as I am. I'm not. We're not called to a low standard. We're not called to shame ourselves. So the world looks at that and says, no, no one should feel shame. Well, I don't want anybody to feel shame. I just want people to actually really feel loved from a genuine place. And see, when God loves you, it says the kindness of God leads us to repentance. And what the world is trying to make up for is what the church has done really bad. The church has tried to shame people into changing. The church has tried to shame people into a relationship with God. We've tried to shame people into becoming better Christians. It's legalism, it's religion. But God doesn't do that. He comes as a friend, he comes as a father. And he says, daughter or son, you're way too good to be living like this. right? Like I would my son. I come to him and I worked with one of my sons last night. He came. He's got some real financial troubles. He just moved out of the house. Hasn't learned the discipline of disciplining himself, right? So he's learned indulgence, and he indulged. And mom and dad are having to bail him out, you know? And so we bailed him out once. We gave him $500, and he was all stoked. All the anxiety left, you know. I wish $500 could change all my anxiety right now. But it changed his, right? He went from being depressed to like, oh, my life's perfect. Well, that only lasted 3 weeks, didn't it? Because again, he doesn't have an ecosystem inside of him that's learned how to manage. It's learned how to manage his impulses. It's learned how to delay gratification. You guys probably do. You go to the store, you don't buy everything you want because you learn the pain of that, right? Somewhere you learn the pain of that. So you're delaying gratification. So my son sat down last night. Last night was a big night for him because we printed out his bank statements, you know, we went through the bank. Where are you indulging? And just think about your life. If we printed out your statement on where you're indulging right now, right? And so we looked and we go like, oh man, DoorDash 92 times this week. Well, you can only do that for so long before you don't have any money because DoorDash isn't, they're not trying to help you out. They're not trying to save you money. You know, you can only get so many video games before, you know, you don't have any money because video games are a $1 billion operation. Like they're not trying to help you. You know, they're trying to help themselves. And it was so cool because my son, he didn't feel any shame. He just got to feel our partnership. He was learning. See, I don't want my son to settle for that type of living. I don't want him to go like, you know what? I'm just really proud of myself right now for how I've been spending and investing my money. He shouldn't feel proud of himself. But I don't need him to feel shame. I don't need him to go, I'm a horrible human being. I'm just messed up. I need him to go, oh man, I've got to learn some things, right? Like I've got to make some adjustments. God has given me so much more than this bondage, right? God has provided a life. It's outside of this bondage. You know, it was so incredible. So we help my son. We go through all these different things, and he feels so powerful now because he actually sees how many hours he works and how much money he brings in after taxes, right? His taxes takes a lot, Dad. And then he's starting to see where he's spending his money. And he's going, oh man, yeah, I started to do this and I was doing that. And he's seeing how not planning for his day is really ruining him. And he only spent $20 at the grocery store the whole month. Amazing. Amazing. This is our life. This is your life. You're laughing at my son, but you're really laughing at you. Now he spends $20 at the grocery store. That's the equivalent of not having any friends. And we'll get to that in a minute. So we go through and create a whole plan for him, you know, and mom breaks down the whole plan. And he's got some background and some history in Dave Ramsey because he went through Dave Ramsey's course at 17, you know, and so he's got some history with that, and he's just feeling so powerful, you know, but he still didn't have hardly any money because he spent it all. So mom and I just had told him, hey, you know, we'll give you some money and to help you. And he's saying like, I'm going to follow the plan, right? I got a plan now. I'm going to follow the plan to get out of poverty. The poverty isn't in the money that he has. It's not in the amount of money. It's in his process. It's in the way of thinking. See, my son is impoverished because of his inability to manage himself, his inability to steward his life. So he's in monetary poverty. We gave him a plan. It was crazy. My wife walked over to the mail. It was 8 o'clock at night. She started opening up the mail, and there was a check in there for my son for $500 that we didn't know about, which was wild, right? Like God literally met my son right where he was at. And he said, oh my gosh, like this is one of the greatest days of my life. $500, one of the greatest days of my son's life. Again, I wish I could go back to that. But when we look at our life, so many of our lives are in poverty We're in poverty because of our ecosystem, of our poor ecosystem. It's not the environment. The environment isn't the problem. It's the ecosystem that's the problem. It's what's going on inside of us. It's I haven't learned how to delay gratification. I haven't learned how to steward myself well. I haven't learned how to create healthy friendships. I haven't learned how to invest. And so I'm suffering. I told you we were going to talk about connection, and we are. I'm moving that direction. Sorry. I'll try to save some time for questions. There won't be much left. But I do want to, where I was highlighting is we've been spoon-fed a whole bunch of trash in our day and age right now, which is just to love yourself where you're at right now. And we do need to love ourselves where we're at, but we also need a standard where you will stay in bondage. You will stay enslaved. That's the story of the Israelites, right? And they got out of Egypt, but they didn't get Egypt out of the Israelites. We stay enslaved in this bondage, and we accept the bondage, right? We accept the slavery. The same way that my son, what he wanted to do, you know what my son wanted to do? He wanted to move back home. He was asking us if he can move back home. You understand? That's its own sort of hell. That's bondage. He's a full-grown man. He's 19 years old. Well, he's not technically a full-grown man, but what does he really need? He doesn't need dad to save him. He needs dad to empower him. Right? You don't need to stay where you're at. You don't need to camp out. You don't need to camp in the wilderness like the Israelites. You don't need to stay in bondage. We need to move ourselves, empower ourselves into another level of living, out of what you were programmed to do and into what God has for you, which is a very painful process. It's a very painful process. It's not just the process of abstinence. It's the process of intentionality. See, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. So many of us, when we got saved 25 years ago, we learned how to abstain from pornography, or we learned how to abstain from alcohol. But you just trade those sins for a lesser of an evil, right? It's like you trade it for isolation. It's like we know that overeating isn't technically a sin, so it's like I don't drink. And I know I'm not trying to hurt people's feelings. I'm in the same boat, right? Like this is my life. This is how I talk to myself. Is I have to be honest. So I abstained from pornography. 16 was the last time that I ever masturbated outside of the marriage bed. I'm not trying to be crude either. I'm trying to just be honest so you guys can see what normal is. And 16 was the last time I ever looked at pornography. That's God's honest truth. Now, have I ever seen a naked woman? I have, not intentionally, right? Like the pornography is the intentional pursuit of, right? Y'all good with that? I have not fallen at all. But I just traded it for a more acceptable coping mechanism. And I'm not saying that that's evil or horrible. I'm just saying ultimately it wasn't how I was designed to live, right? I used to fly fish 4 days a week. I became obsessed with fly fishing for years, like 6 or 7 years. I got to the highest level of tying flies. I tie flies every single night. And it's great. You know, everyone was like, man, that's awesome, Jay. You're so good at that. Yeah, except for my wife. My wife hated it because again, I didn't understand it. I just thought I was obsessed. I just thought I really loved fishing, which I do really love fishing, but it was my coping mechanism to deal with my anxiety. I don't know how to deal with my anxiety. So I get so obsessive about this one thing. And again, I'm not saying throw your hobbies out. I'm just saying your hobby shouldn't control you, right? What is addiction? Addiction is giving up the things that you love for the thing that you don't love. That's addiction. I give up these things that I really love for this thing that I don't really love. And even though I know that it's hurting me, I prioritize it in my life. A lot of you, that was your childhood, right? Like your parents gave you up for this thing that they hate, the alcohol, the women, but I can't stop this thing because I need it. So I'm sacrificing everything I really love for this thing that I don't love. What's the antidote? Why do I'm talking so much about addiction? Because most of us really, really struggle with some form of it. Really struggle with some form of it. What's the antidote? The antidote's real connection. Real connection. Deep connection. Real regulation with yourself and others. Right. So I'm going to go through just very quickly. I need 2 hours to do this, but I'm going to go through really quickly and give you the building blocks for connection, because most people just go connections, vulnerability. You got to be vulnerable. It's like, that's just one step. Most people are using their vulnerability to get their needs met, right? So that's prostitution. Is like, I give you my vulnerability, you give me uh, substance, and we both get our needs met. But it's not real vulnerability. It's not real connection. Prostitution. So there's 4 steps to the building blocks of connection. At least 4 that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to give you some definitions. They're not my definitions. They're Brene Brown's definitions. And maybe you go, Brene Brown supports the LGBTQ community. That's great. She does. I'm not endorsing her as like the whatever, the hierarchy of goodness or something. I'm just saying I really liked her definitions for these. So the first one is courage. Courage is the ability to tell your story with your whole heart, being willing to bear your imperfections. Courage. Courage is the ability to tell your story with your whole heart and being willing to bear your imperfections. The ability to tell your story with your whole heart, being willing. Everybody say, I'm willing to bear my imperfections. That's a friggin' tough thing to do. Let me ask you guys, can we all just be honest just for 1 minute here? How many of you have secrets that you've never shared? You have secrets that you've never shared with anybody. You know what that does to us? Is it says to us that there's places inside of us, there's things that we've done that if people really knew about it, they would reject us. And we lock up a whole bunch of us inside of these secrets, right? Our secrets begin to define us. They say people can only see this side of you, they can't see this side of you. They can know this much, they can't know this much. And especially not your partner, right? Especially not your spouse. Because man, if they really knew, they would really be ashamed of you. The truth is, again, you're wanting somebody to do something that you can't do for yourself. You're ashamed of you. You're embarrassed about that decision. You're living in regret. So how am I going to be connected to people when I don't want to connect with me? I don't want to connect with all of me. I don't want to. It doesn't happen. So what happens is you get these really superficial relationships. They only go so deep. They never quite fully scratch the itch. Because in order to scratch the itch, I've got to bear my imperfections. I got to show you, right? You got to love the real me, not the fake me. You got to love the all of me. But we get taught, right? We get taught that we got to dress up for church. We get taught that God needs us to come in clean, right? We get taught that we're the ones that clean ourselves up. You're not the one that cleaned yourself up. You don't even have the power to do it. He was the one that cleaned you up. But now we have a problem, don't we? Because the Bible says that your sins will find you out. It's a shame, isn't it? It's like you hide that thing, you hide that thing, you hide that thing, and all the while it's like a sliver that's just infected in there, and it's so hard whenever people hug you because they're pushing on that pain, and all you really want to do is be free of it, but it's a mistake that you made a long time ago. So we live in regret until eventually it gets exposed, and there's lots of ways that happens. And some people, I'm sure, die with their sins or secrets or whatever. But your relationships suck, and you never feel fully accepted, and you blame everybody else. You blame your spouse and you blame. But the truth is that it's you. You don't fully accept you. You don't feel like God's fully forgiven you or accepted you. And so you hide. What's the alternative? The alternative is incredible courage. Courage. The ability to tell your story with your whole heart, being willing to bear your imperfections. See, when I come and I share my whole story, I've shared some stories with you guys today. I shared the stories about masturbation when I was really young, even ones where you guys go, wow, that's a lot. 20 times. Boy, he was really working hard at that, you know? There's a lot of shame in that. There's a lot of pain in that. But I understand that guy. I understand that kid. I understand why he did that. I understand why he was so desperate. I do. And I love him. I don't need to be ashamed of that. Oh, maybe that's embarrassing for you. It's not embarrassing for me. It's just where I was. It's just what I was dealing with. I'm not proud of it, but it's just where I was. I understand that. But step two is compassion. So you have to first be kind to yourself and then kind to others, because you can't give something away that you don't already possess. Compassion. Once again, so many of us have such a hard time really connecting with other people because we can't empathize with ourselves. Never learn how to empathize. Man, imagine how hard it is to feel felt, to feel connection, to feel together and with somebody if you aren't able to empathize, if you aren't able to have compassion on them. You literally don't know what it feels like. And see, all connection, just follow me here. Connection happens through the exchange of emotion, not through the exchange of information. That's where married couples get it so wrong. Oh, your mom called today. The kids went to school. Johnny got an A. Oh, Mikey got an F. Oh, I got to bring some firewood in. Oh, we got to pay some bills. And we think that spending time is connection. It's not. It's the exchange of emotion. I come home, my daughter, she's 3 years old, and my son, who's a year and a half. When I come home, they throw their arms up and they scream and they run towards me. And do you know what I do? I throw my arms up and I yell and I run towards them and I pick them up and I throw them up and they are screaming and yelling. What are we doing? We are exchanging emotion. Imagine that I come home, right? Imagine I come home and I see them and my daughter just looks at me and gives me a nod and I look at her and give her a little nod. Then I walk over, I pick her up and I throw her and she just goes up and down. That's some of your marriages. That's some of your relationships. See, the exchange of emotion is a very risky thing, especially when you grew up in a home where it was used against you, where it looked weak, where it wasn't impressive. What are our core emotions? You go, well, fear, that's a core emotion. Shame is a core emotion. How many of you felt shame today? Probably all of you just aren't aware of it. You so repress it. Guilt is core emotion. Loneliness is a core emotion. Sadness is a core emotion. And joy is core emotion. And we experience those almost all every single day. And you go like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's from the connection codes. You go, oh my gosh, I shouldn't feel shame. It's like, well, you're not in charge of whether or not you feel shame. You're in charge of whether or not you live in shame. You're not trying to feel angry. You just do feel angry. It's not good or bad. So that's why Jesus felt all those things. It wasn't good or bad. It's just where you're at. If you don't have the ability to connect to that, to connect to compassion, to connect to yourself, then you won't connect to anybody. And you stay isolated and lonely and depressed and again, medicated, right? This is the pathway. This is what we have to medicate. We have to medicate your disconnection. Courage, compassion, authenticity. Authenticity makes way for real connection. Because authenticity is letting go of who you think that you should be and grabbing a hold of who you really are today. We talked a little bit about this already. I got to speed up. I got to somehow manifest 30 more minutes. Authenticity is letting go of who you think that you should be and grabbing a hold of who you really are today, where you're really at today. This is the poser, right? This is the poser. This is the guy for us men, right? We want to talk about our accomplishments. We want to talk about where we're headed, where we're going. But people don't really connect to where you're going. They don't connect to the promise of who you're going to be. Don't love me for who I'm going to be. Don't connect to me for what my potential is. Love me for who I am today. Let's see, we're back to, I think that I should be more. I think I should be further ahead. Where I'm at today is not enough. We constantly live in this mindset, this idea that I'm too far behind. It's not impressive. It's not enough. And so I never actually embrace me. I never actually love me. I love the idea of who I'm becoming. I love the idea of who I'm going to be, which means I have a whole bunch of disappointment about who I am. And if I'm disappointed about who I am I really going to show other people where I'm at? Probably not. No. I need to be something else in order to be loved. I need to be further along in order to be loved. And again, we've talked about not lowering the standard, right? We're called to the high calling of Christ, not the low calling. But also, I want people to love me where I'm at, right? To love me is to know me. You have to actually know me to love me. I don't need my dad to be okay with my mistakes. I need him to love me in my mistakes. I don't need my kids to be okay with my failures. I need them to love me in my failures. And I need to be reminded to grow. I need to be partnered with, like, okay, we can't keep living this, can't keep coming home being disconnected. Right? I don't need my wife to accept that, but I do need her to understand why that happened. Man, I just felt so overwhelmed and I checked out. She goes like, gosh, babe, I really understand that. She's not saying, feel free to check out at home. She's saying, I really understand what that's like. What do you need? Right? High calling. Last one, vulnerability. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, creativity, connection. See, we mess vulnerability up so much because what we really do is we do transparency. Transparency says you can see me, but you can't touch me. Vulnerability gives you permission to wound me. Transparency is what most ladies do when they go shopping. I just like to look at things. Like you look and you look and you look and you look. You can't really buy it, right? It's like window shopping. It's what we do. We feel good about it, right? And we do it like this. We tell people the mistake that we made 30 years ago. I share a lot of my story, right? I share about when I had oral sex with a guy friend of mine when I was 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old. And people could tell me all the time, like, oh my gosh, you're so vulnerable. No one can actually hurt me with that story. I've weaponized that story. It happened 31 years ago. And it doesn't feel vulnerable anymore. If I had never shared that story, yeah, I'd be vulnerable. That's not vulnerable. It's just transparent. It's facts. I'm using that story to give people the courage to know that they can get out of it. It's just a testimony. It's not vulnerable. It's not vulnerable. You know what's vulnerable? Is what I'm going through right now, today. That right now. That's harder. It's harder for me to talk about what I felt like leaving my last appointment than it is to talk about the oral sex I had with the boy. That's real. That's vulnerability. When I give my wife or I give my best friends access to the deepest place of me today, not last week, not that thing I already figured out last week, Guys, that's not vulnerable. Talking to people about something you've already solved is not vulnerable. What's really going on inside of you? What's really happening? See, that's where your emotions are all locked up. That's where you're dysregulated. That's where you're living in fear. That's where you're disconnected. So listen, when we learn how to do these things, right? When we learn how to accept ourselves, we learn how to have compassion, we learn how to come authentically with where we're really at, which means probably gonna have to forgive yourself. Probably have to walk yourself through some forgiveness for some mistakes that you made, or walk yourself through forgiveness for being lazy. I had a really hard time, 2015, 16, some 2017. I just hated my life. I hated it. And I realized at one point, I felt so much shame every day. I really wanted to escape that. I started to realize, like, I'm breaking my promises. I'm sleeping till 9 a.m. I don't work out. I eat whatever I want to eat. I'm 20 pounds overweight. I don't work hard when I'm at work. Like, how am I supposed to feel proud of that? I'm breaking my own promises, right? Like, my relationships are suffering. Of course, they're suffering. They're suffering because you don't like you. You're not proud of you. Well, it's not like go fix all that stuff and then have healthy relationships. It's like, no, let somebody in that can really see you and go, hey, Jay, let me walk with you. I had to let my dad in. I had to let my therapist in. I had to let my wife in. I remember going to my wife. I literally remember walking up to my wife and saying, I feel a lot of shame because I'm breaking my promises because I don't actually like how I'm living. And when I look at you, when I take my shirt off, I feel shame. I don't like how I look. When I, and it, listen, it's not like I have to look a certain way in order to love myself. It's not like I have to have six pack. It's like I knew that the way I looked was because of my self neglect. You get that? I understand. Like, I'm gonna get old someday. I'm not gonna be able to do everything I can do. I understand. I'm gonna fade. I'm gonna age. It's not about how I look. It's about my neglect, about my short term gratification. Not, it's all that stuff. So to me, this is probably the most important step in emotional health. Is is this talk right here, right? Because we have to actually go back to our origin of what created you, what created your operating system. Why are you the way that you are? And then what has that done with your life? What has that done to your ability to attach, to regulate, to connect? And then what's the ecosystem that you're living in right now that you're perpetuating? So many of us try to, I'm just wrapping this all up. We try to change our diet or get on a diet. We try to, put porn blockers on, or we try to not buy certain things, and all that stuff's fine. But if you don't actually start to deal with the core, then I'm just going to go from one thing to the next to the next. I got to get out the sin. I got to get out the hidden living. I've got to let some real people in. I've got to really love myself. I've got to really accept myself. I've got to quit breaking my promises. I got to live a disciplined life. I got to set a time. I got to live by a calendar. Quit living a chaotic life. I got to wake up on time. I got to work out, physically work out. I got to exercise. I feel good about myself when I exercise. I got to connect with God, right? Like, I got to do the things that I know to do that says you're loving. You are actually loving you. You are taking care of you. You are doing the things that you know to do to the extent that you can, while dealing with the other emotional things. So, yeah, because I'm sorry I didn't save more time. But I'm gonna pray for us. And the truth is that we're all on this journey together in on varying stages of it. And I don't have this all figured out. I don't. I still deal with anxieties and I still deal with stress. But For me, I just continue to refuse to let myself stay in an ecosystem that is less than what God has called me to. I refuse to let myself stay disconnected or dysregulated or give myself excuses to not take care of my body, not take care of my soul, not take care of my spirit. So that's the journey that we're on. So, Father, I thank you, Lord, for each person here, God. Lord, I just ask that you would help us to be the most whole, connected, loving people on the planet, Lord, that we would be the ones that model emotional health, God, that we'd be the ones that model real connection. Lord, I just pray that you give us a grace to walk into that. Lord, we have a grace to step into wholeness, into health, God. And Lord, even for us, God, I ask that you would do what you can do, or that you would go in and rewire our brains, or that you would go in and heal the addictions and the neural pathways, God, that you would rewire that stuff. But Lord, that you would also give us the tools to create a healthy ecosystem. Amen. Guys, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your time and for your participation. And honestly, if I had it, if I wasn't running to a lunch appointment, I would do another hour of questions. But thank you guys for your time.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to the BraveCo podcast. If you like this podcast, would you please rate it, review it, leave us a great comment. And if you like this episode in particular, share it with your friends and family. That helps us to spread the word. Guys, stay brave. We'll see you next week.